The destructive global myth of world religions, a perspective from Africa. First and author note. Academia and the media take world religions as being different expressions with distinct identities and history of a universal feature common to all mankind called religion. This presentation suggests instead that world religions are made up of projections of Christianity onto the ways of life of non-Western people. The supposed universal content of religion, some point out, actually describes Christian belief. So in this presentation I challenge the myth that there are world religions. I consider it to be linguistically careless, I consider it to be philosophically biased, and I consider it to be historically and empirically false. It's also anti-development and contrary to human thriving. Writing that challenges widely presupposed linguistic and meaning categories invariably risks internal contradiction. Consideration of the term religion and related categories like secular and Christian in this presentation illustrate this. Scholarly efforts at transforming or undermining such terms run against the widespread but problematic ways of using them. That is, unless one uses neologisms, existing terms will retain reverberations of the past meanings. This will cause ongoing tensions and sometimes contradictions in texts such as what I'm presenting here. Introduction. It is a strange but frequent experience to find world religions frequently described in very Western ways. That is, even when the lives of the adherents of those religions are far from Western. Closer examination reveals that the content of what Westerners term religion often rests upon Western Protestant Christian presuppositions. In the West, religions are often imagined negations of secularism. So in that scenario, the religion is usually private, the secular is public. This is clearly not the understanding of religion for those for whom secularism is a stranger. For these reasons, I will argue in this presentation that world religions are reifications generated by imprudent globalized applications of Christian theology. The assumption that religion, as it is widely understood in the West, is a universal experience for mankind is extremely misleading. It is an untruth, however, that it's widespread in Western and also globalized discourse. The assumption suggests that what Christianity brings is already everywhere, i.e. religion. The assumption has been used to discourage people from adopting Christianity, which used to be seen as a solution of people's problems. Those problems, that is, brought by superstition, and thus pagan and irrational understanding. Use of the term religion to describe both Christianity and the latter superstitions has been catastrophic for sense-making. So hegemonic use of Western languages in global communication systems, when combined with economic domination, contribute to the West's ignorance of the wider world. This ignorance has itself contributed to a complacent assumption of the existence of a kind of equality of world religions that runs almost directly in the face of the actuality of the West's Christian history. This history is candidly illustrated by Tom Holland, who unhesitatingly credits Christianity for today's globally dominant values. To undermine the assumption of the universal presence of religion is also to challenge a contemporary project of global secularization. The universality of secularism presupposes that there must be a universality of religion. So if religion is not a universal category, then neither can its co-joined twin, secularism. This kind of undermining of secularism is extremely unsettling to current world orders. Compare this to the alternative scenario. If Christianity is the archetypal religion, then secularism is a category that incorporates all that is not Christian. I personally discovered the tendency to believe this, especially amongst some highly educated African people. On this basis, people's traditional ways of life, no matter how religious they may appear to be to Westerners, according to some African people, fall into the category of being secular. Some scholars have accused those who consider Christianity to be the universal faith to be practicing gross pro-Western bias. This is on the assumption that Christianity is defined exclusively by the West, such that others becoming Christian would either have to become Western or subservient to the West. Statistics on religion in Africa offer an interesting case study. For example, Kenya is said to be 82% Christian. If correct that Christianity must be Western, this will tell Westerners that 82% of Kenyans believe much as they do. If this is a position amongst Kenyans officially or even popularly, it may have more to do with the West desiring what they want to believe to be true, more to do with donor money than with the actual diversity of what is labelled as Christian in Kenya. Some Western scholars can be very damning of African Christianity, especially on the basis of its supposed adherence to prosperity teaching. Yet, if these people who self-identify as Christian greatly value the Bible, gather for weekly worship, and so on, are not Christian, then what are they? In other words, Western bias implicit to considering their own kinds of Christianity as universal depends on a narrow interpretation. Such narrow interpretation is aided by domestication affected by translations of the nature articulated by the author Venuti. I.e., the West learning about Africa through Western languages contributes to what it hears seeming familiar. My own experience of working with African people on the ground, this is since 1988, tells me that Christianity is broader than Western versions in ways beyond many Christian scholars' wildest dreams or nightmares. Let us say that Bibles translated into their own languages are highly valued texts to people who don't know even what a proper Christian should be. This presentation argues on the assumption that the category religion is itself fashioned on the assumptions of Western Protestant Christianity, that comparisons between world religions are profoundly introspective. It suggests that interreligious dialogue engages circular arguments created in the course of translation of other people's ways of life into English. Now, Western academia has taken debates to compare religions relatively seriously. But if that debate is only a meticulous examination of religions as the West projects them, rather than what actually exists beyond the West, how much is the debate worth? What collateral damage has arisen as a result of framing the debate around these Western Christian-based projections called world religions? What is needed to reframe the whole debate? So, linguistic be careless with the term religion. The term religion originated in the West and originally referred to Christianity. Now, everything except secularism is called religion. Masuzawa tells us that Troeltsch conjures up out of thin air something like religion itself as a pure sphere of life. Contemporary people may well say that of course there is such a thing as religion, such as being a foundational belief in the 20th and into the 21st century. But I want to ask, is there religion? Are there religions? If so, then just what are they? Teaching Bible and theology at an American-run Bible college in Kenya for 15 years part-time, I found a world religions course on the curriculum. It was a compulsory class for all students. I probably hardly blinked on discovering the presence of this course. I did not know at the time how popular it was. It's very popular around the world, especially in the UK, where it's an economic mainstay apparently to many colleges. It seems that many students around the world have loved world religions courses. I also considered it a natural component for our theological school. Surely it'd be good for our Christian students to be familiar with other religions, I thought. So apparently have many others thought. It has been assumed that such instruction would help evangelists to know what they're up against. I put in place an annual field visit, visiting institutions representing world religions in the nearby town of Kisumu. Students loved this field trip. For some it was the only field trip they had for the whole 3 or 4 year course of their study. In due course I also became a little perplexed. Having by that time spent over 20 years living in Africa, deeply rooted in local community and regularly using people's own languages, the style in which we taught world religions seemed very foreign. There was little option on how to teach world religions. All our textbooks came from the West. The language in use was English. We were preparing students for exams, many of which came from the USA. I was struck by the fact that the way I was required to teach world religions was frankly vastly different to how students themselves reacted to the practices of adherents of those world religions. In other words, to enlighten my students about the Orient, we had to travel through Europe. Descriptions of world religions always had to be very Western. For example, one of the courses on the world religions curriculum was on Islam. Many Kenyan and East African students had first-hand experience of meeting and engaging with Muslims. Some had been Muslims. The comment I seem to hear most frequently about Muslims was that they do not and cannot drive away evil spirits. This ability, or its absence, did not feature in any of the books we had about Islam. So was giving instruction on world religions presupposing a Western worldview that our students did not share? I often wondered how different would a book on world religions be if it were written by an African. That is, of course, assuming the African write on the basis of their personal experience of the practice of another religion and not on the basis of what Westerners had already discovered and written about the same. It should be noted that because the West contrasts religion with secularism, it is saying that everyone who is not secular is religious. And since secularism is the Western invention, the West is effectively saying that everyone who is not Western is religious. World religions, then, are all various ways of life except those of secular Westerners. I don't know how often people think about that. Once having set up this construct, then the West attempts to find secular aspects of other ways of life, of other people, in order to tease out what is secular from what is religious. Very often the West then focuses on what is identified as being secular, while choosing to ignore the religious bit, trusting that it will in due course go away. This arises at least in part from the Western practice of using social science tools that largely ignore conflictual situations arising from mimesis, that is imitation or envy, to explore and define people. If, as René Girard finds clearly to be the case, things religious are there to counter violence, this explains why, as observed by Jonathan Bentall, where a religious society represses a religious imagination, the human predisposition to religion will in the end break out. The role of religion as countering violence has in recent decades, if not centuries, been concealed in the West by its position that religion causes violence. This has resulted in scholars like Riesebord simply making assertions to the effect that certain wars are religious. Kavanagh tackles this default error in great detail. Around 2007, I struck up a friendship with an American who at the time was living in India. He and I compared notes. How did my observations on Africa compare with his of India? Surprisingly, the two geographically very distinct cultures seem to have strong parallels and similarities. I was surprised because I thought India was Hindu, and world religions textbooks describe Hinduism as a religion of India with certain, specific content, features, beliefs and practices. So how could there be so much similarity? Gauging from those books, Hindus should have behaved quite differently to native people living in East Africa. Why were he and I finding so many similarities? Muslim anthropologist Assad might have been the first person I came across who pointed out frankly that it is illegitimate to consider religion to be a universal complement to secularism everywhere. Religion, Assad points out, describes something along the lines of Western Protestant Christianity. The only religion then, in a sense, is Western Protestant Christianity. Takes some thinking about, doesn't it? That's what defines religion, so in the end we back up to find just Western Protestant Christianity is a legitimate religion in another sense of the word. The suggestion that religion in the Western interpretation is universal to all people everywhere is false. It is a distortion of Protestant Christianity's universal claims, already mentioned above, that ignores the possibility of there being non-Western Christianities. I've often observed parallels to the above kinds of westernization of world religions occurring in Africa. Sani describes a clear example in the case of Ifa in Nigeria. Ifa is taken to be a kind of Christ, or a type of Christ. Yet, while Nigerians consider Ifa to be like Jesus, official accounts of Nigerian Christianity, of course, are communicated using English based on a European blueprint. So Ifa, in the minds of Westerners, is therefore Westernized. After almost 3 decades of close linguistic and lifestyle engagement with the Kenyan tribe, seeing how African practices are hidden behind Western English Christian labels has personally been frustrating and sobering. Europeans are the ones who continue to define categories. They are the ones who set the parameters for what it is to be an African Christian. So strange. Now, Africans acquiesce to these labels. I mean, they have little choice. At least if the Europeans identify them, it gives them a kind of a recognized place on the global map of peoples and issues. And sometimes, of course, a globalized role or globalized possible target for donors. So African people have modeled themselves on the rich and powerful Western Christian peoples. But accepting the labels does not mean that they consider themselves bound by the contents of those labels. They can call themselves Christians while practicing Ifa. When one realizes that the study of world religions is largely a study of labels projected by the West onto people far away, the whole enterprise becomes more and more suspect. Now, I could also make a more general point here. African Christianities generally use indigenous names for God. This is bound to result in their understanding God differently than the Westerners. In other words, when they're using the label God is misleading when they engage in discourse about their ways of life using English. Let's use a theoretical example to try and bring this point home to Westerners. Picture a missionary, say from Africa, coming to the UK. And this missionary coming to the UK takes evolution to be the closest term in English to translate the theory of the Bible. So we would find Trinity would be evolution the Father, evolution the Son, and evolution the Holy Ghost. In church we would encourage people to have faith in what? In evolution. Yes, I do stand with those incredulous Africans who are wondering what has happened to the motherlands of the gospel that this continent, Africa, has come to so value. One thing I campaign for is Westerners to take African languages seriously when studying Africa. Not to do so is to overlook, unfortunately, rafts of indigenous truths. But many don't. Few Westerners take African languages seriously. My above example of the Ifa, whereby ancient Nigerian practices seem to just become subsumed under the label Christian, is only one example of what is of course a very widespread phenomenon. Westerners, as a result of this phenomenon, who only hear reporting English, assume ancient practices such as Oath of Ifa to be gone. Western media needs to be held accountable on these kind of issues or mistranslations. Serious reporting to the West about Africa that does not render African culture invisible should always be done by Western people who understand at least one underlying African language, who receive information in that language. Only thus will the folly associated with unthinking use of poorly rooted hegemonic terms in English be avoided. This whole thing is also philosophically biased. The question of whether Africa has its own religion or religions. Now, Beatty gave an affirmative answer. Surely, Beatty seemed to reason, if other people had religions, then so should Africa. So he sought to contradict the view of many that Africa was primal and animistic, and that its people's practices were simply based on superstition. I doubt whether he was very aware of our debate on whether religion actually exists in the first place. Masuzawa tells us that 11 religions are typically listed as world religions, these being Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Jainism, Confucianism, Taoism, Shinto, and often Sikhism. Now, all of the above originate in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East. Because world religion status is higher than that of people whose way of life is not a world religion, non-possessors of a world religion, such as Africans, may either try to acquire a world religion or to demonstrate that their way of life is a religion. You see, there's a motive now for identifying as a religion, nothing to do with the truth, but there's incentives. My taking Masuzawa's argument as seeking to counter-colonizing other people's ways of life into the Western category of religion may be different from her own original intention. Yet, whether she realized it or not, I suggest her writings are wide open to interpretation as a defense of claims of a wider Christianity's worldwide biblically based movement. Holland articulates numerous ways in which the Christianity that was extant before the time of Constantine has transformed itself in the course of upheavals into European values which have come to be interpreted as implicit to Christianity itself. A simple example of this would be the sexual revolution that has transformed European people's family structures. As a result, many take Christianity to be implicitly monogamous, a conclusion with which Africa is struggling. Given Holland's account, which explains how it took centuries for the contemporary Western Church to arrive at its current stand regarding monogamy, any African Christianity not being strictly monogamous might not indicate any weakness of the gospel or even lack of faith. It simply demonstrates that old habits die hard. The way in which members of what are now called world religions have vied to make their way of life resemble Christianity is illustrated by Vivekananda's words stated in 1893. The Hindus have received their religion through their revelation, the Vedas, says Vivekananda. He adds, they hold that the Vedas are without beginning and without end. Vivekananda was attending the Parliament of Religions held in Chicago. An astute observer will note that his phraseology comes straight out of Christian theology, with Hindu substituted for Christian and Vedas for the biblical books. Invented world religions can incorporate much of Jesus' teachings while omitting his name. Is it any wonder then that Western Christians have been in confused despair when comparing their own faith with other world religions? They have been standing in a hall of mirrors, observing distortions of their own reflection. They have been looking at projections of parts of their own faith draped like foreign clothes over other people's ways of life. Now, it should be noted, of course, that the case of Hinduism is different from that of ether. I mean, Nigerians practicing ether that did not have a world religion status wanted to be identified as Christians so as to appropriate a prestigious foreign identity. In the case of Hinduism, people wanted to show that their religion has good features like that of Christianity. That's the way, their religion has good features, and thus that they can enhance the status of their way of life. So you see, those things are quite different. In Nigeria, people want to be known as Christians so as to have a world religion identity, whereas in India, Hinduism claimed to be a world religion and, in order to be reputable, took on characteristics of Christianity. So in India, when people's practice or way of life came to be recognized as a world religion, then it was okay for them to be not identified as Christians. Masuzawa examines the 19th century pursuit of comparative theology. And this looked at ways of life of people around the world before they were covered in Christian clothing to be identified as pseudo-Christianities. Yeah, how were these people living before they came to be described as if they were Christian? Before they came to be described as Christian, before they came to be described as world religions, because world religions are modelled on Christianity. So numerous senior scholars wrote volumes of confirmations to the superiority of Christianity. All their work was categorically rejected in the 20th century, Masuzawa tells us. It's not rejected because it was not thorough, it was not scholarly. It was rejected because it became inimical to 20th century Europeans that their own religion could be so superior to everybody else's. It's kind of a false humility. The 19th century work in the light of that appeared naive at best, disingenuous at worst, according to people who by then were incapable of taking these pronouncements seriously. Partly at least this must have arisen due to Islam's particular animosity to Christianity. By making Christianity one amongst many religions while claiming to be secular and not Christian, some Westerners endeavoured to sidestep some of Islam's aggression. Muslims themselves would of course have been very happy to be given a status that fell short of that of Christianity. So the prolific scholarship under the heading of comparative theology that I clearly demonstrated in the 19th century Christianity superiority was rejected. Why? Because the world religions discourse had by the 20th century already concluded that Christianity should be considered provincial and that secularism instead should be considered to be universal. A discipline also labelled comparative theology has emerged since the 1990s. It's largely associated with the name Francis Clooney. Paul Hedges, author of an article on comparative theology, clearly a major contributor to debates on contemporary comparative theology, concedes that his work focuses on English. I suggest there are a number of serious limitations to repeating ditched 19th century comparative theology. Number one, scholars confining themselves to English. Many 19th century insights were acquired from explorers and missionaries who were familiar with other languages and who had vulnerable experiential exposure to non-Western cultures, things that scholars these days very rarely achieve. Secondly, ways in which globally recognized religious traditions have already been profoundly influenced by Christianity to make it especially difficult to access lived practices as against interpretations of ways of life, religion cleansed for international consumption. That is, religion is two things. There's, look, this is the way you should understand us to be, so this is a show we'll make for you, and this is how we'll explain ourselves, which can be quite different from the way people actually are living according to that supposed religion. Thirdly, an outlook very different to that of the 19th century with respect to race. Open racialization of academia in the 19th century has been replaced by covert concealing of ongoing racialized presuppositions dressed up as anti-racism, I suggest. In reality, contemporary scholars describing beliefs and practices of others often have to do so while walking on eggshells. This is so as to preempt accusations they may be racially biased. Again, another good reason, as far as those scholars are concerned, to make sure they describe other religions as if they are Christianity-like, as if they're like Christianity. This despite the fact that many supposed racial differences are essentially lifestyle differences. In the course of time, scholars lost access to other religions. That is, the other religions now described as world religions, as if they're Christianized, are the accounts that came to be popular and widespread. So how they're actually practiced has become more and more difficult to discern. Even translation of descriptions of other religions into European languages, under pressure not to be Eurocentric, i.e. racist, and helped by some enemies of the gospel, began to depict them as if the other religions were varieties of Christianity. To describe another religion using English is to Christianize it. That's because religious terms in English predominantly originate in Christianity. Only projected Christian versions of other religions then remain visible. Pragmatically, though perhaps naively, it seems that the thought that one religion might be superior to another has become opprobrium in the nostrils of powerful people. Instead of Christianity, it was religion from here on that was seen as universal. In other words, religion is seen as something like Protestant Christianity, why not called by that name, and the same category of religion incorporates the very constituents of people's previous ways of life that Christianity had come to resolve. Now just think about witch doctors. Christianity comes to tell the witch doctor the truth, if you like. Now, witch doctor practice and Christianity, well, they're all just considered religion. Confusion reigns. But Europeans have become enamored by an intense determination to refuse and mock any pretensions by which any one religion might be considered superior to another. Instead, all religions are considered to be what? Different expressions of the same assumed universal tendency to be religious. So Western society now looks for what it used to get in Christianity to be also there in various religions: Judaism, Confucianism, Shintoism, Buddhism, Islam, and so on. When it fails to find what it's looking for, it scolds itself for not looking hard enough. In other words, it's not that it concludes those things are not there in those other religions. It knows they're there, it just hasn't been able to find them yet. When it does not find what it's looking for, it intentionally forgets ways in which Christianity has influenced those religions. Now, the languages of the same Christian West, English in particular, of course, have recently been pressed into global service. This is apparently to bring confirmation of the same deception. Jews, Confucians, adherents of Shintoism, Buddhists, Muslims and others, what language do they use when they communicate to Europe? Well, European languages, English, so on. Thus, terms traditionally used by Christianity are by default appropriated by other world religions. Europeans remain oblivious to the content of these terms in practice. Such association between Christianity and other world religions was considered abhorrent by some well-informed scholars when it first occurred. Their views, of course, subsequently have been ignored. This situation was aggravated by the dominance of translation of a certain ilk. That is, we could call it translations from known to unknown, i.e. Western scholars acquiring their insights from non-Westerners, articulated here as being far from adequate. Paul Gifford's writing on Africa may be instructive here. Gifford, that is Emeritus Professor of the School of Orient and African Studies in the University of London, spent 30 years exploring African Christianities. After independence, when missionaries lost what appeared to be of their lifeline connection to colonial power, Western scholars expected the Christian church in Africa to go into decline. This prediction has proved completely false, Gifford tells us. Instead, the Christian church in sub-Saharan Africa has been booming. Christianity is now perhaps the most salient social force in sub-Saharan Africa, shares Gifford. Now, embarrassed Western scholars turn their eyes away. Maybe their secular stand is collapsing, but that's the horse that they've been backing. Even if it's a dead horse, they can't afford to stop. That's to say, the fact that Christianity might be booming in Africa so contradicts to what the West has been wanting to believe that they choose to ignore it for as long as they possibly can. Below a veneer of apparently racial impartiality, they may also covertly consider that adoption of Christianity by African people can be explained by their low levels of intelligence. This raises agenda, of course, at the edges of mainstream academia. Scholars are afraid to own up to what is actually happening. Some Western scholars are surprised to discover the high-profile acceptability and desirability of religion, i.e. Christianity, around the world. For example, Ben Jones, University of East Anglia, is forced to acknowledge an unexpected enormous level of acceptance of Pentecostal Christianity in his research village in Uganda. Any serious examination of the history of today's prosperous West will quickly reveal it to have been Christian, Western Christian, and especially Protestant Western Christian. Since the finding of correlation is less than a proof of causation, historical correlation is not in itself a proof that Christianity causes prosperity. Other evidence, though, does point us in that direction. Europeans are still apparently embarrassed by their enormous success, so they continue to practice self-deprecation. This works out as being an undervaluing of the role of Yahweh and his Son Jesus Christ. That is, even while the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, is embracing the gospel of Jesus with open arms. So ironically then, religion, both in the sense that it's Christianity, in the sense that it's and in the sense that it's not, has become a possession of the majority world. Now, I mean, humility may be one thing, but denial of truth surely is another. Why is Europe trying to prevent other people from benefiting from the gospel that nurtured Europeans themselves? These days, when one gives Christianity credit for doing good in the contemporary world, one also has to concede that it has been responsible for a great deal of violence. So this apparently evaluates Christianity as a kind of in a kind of balance. This self-imposed misdirected humility, I suggest, is rather faulty. Holland helps us here. He sees that a corrective on the condemnation of the track record of Christianity over recent centuries is helped by going back further, basically. So when Holland explores the ancient world, he finds cruel slaughters, crucifixions, people being impaled, going on kind of constantly then. So this to Holland's 21st century mind was just abhorrent. So then Holland asked himself, well, what has transformed that kind of cruel way of life into what we have today? Well, it's the church, it's the gospel. In this sense, contemporary people who criticize Christianity from the position of wanting to avoid the kind of cruelty that used to happen, of course, are criticizing Christianity with Christianity. Let's look at slavery of black Africans, for example, and let's contrast what the West did, black Africans, and what the Arab countries did in the days of the slave trade to black Africans. Yeah, Arab countries would castrate them, make sure they didn't reproduce. They might marry the women, but they castrate the men. So there's a very different picture in the Arab world, because those blacks who survived as a community in the West never did so. And other parallel examples could be given, and we talk about punishment. I suggest that punishment these days is sometimes necessitated because witchcraft is no longer considered a legitimate means to control one's children. So in other words, whereas in the past you told children, look, our neighbour's a witch, they do what you say through fear of the neighbour. If you no longer believe in witchcraft, then you need some other means, arguably, in order to point children in the right direction. So the question shouldn't be, of course, whether Christians have ever been cruel. Of course they've been cruel, especially in the view of those who like to sit judgmentally on others. Yet a pall of anxiety, Holland says, tends to be on the hearts of Christian people when they remember whatever it is they're doing, that their founder, their Lord, was himself wrongly accused and crucified on a cross. So condemnation of Christianity as violent have often been rooted in lies. What's rarely being considered is counterfactual. Okay, so Christians generate some violence, but what would the world be like today if there were no Christianity at all? These days, of course, many scholars compare religions. Now, I suggest that comparative religion is at heart a man putting himself above God. In other words, it questions the basis on which they're going to be compared. Real comparative religions, I suggest, for those I've already referred to, working in the area of comparative theology in the 19th century. Those scholars also, in those days, had access to the kinds of truths that these days occluded from view. Truths, that is, regarding the miserable ways of life that arose from things that were not Christian. These ways of life are nowadays less evident. Why? Well, partly because the Christian West has spearheaded development around the world and improved the quality of life of other people. And also epistemologically, because the West these days informs itself by what other people tell them in English. And when other people talk to them in English, they tend to reflect what the West believes itself and has said to them. So the globalization of English means also that fewer and fewer Western people acquire profound knowledge of non-Western languages, and thus fewer and fewer Western people acquire profound knowledge of non-Western ways of life. Much contemporary interest in world religions is said to help people be amused and diverted by the narratives of exotic love, travels and adventures abroad, says Maswazawa. That was way back, even in the 17th century, but I think the same thing continues today. People like to hear about world religions to kind of, to be amazed, to be incredulous, and of course so as to consider themselves superior as secularists. So Western people who, because of their secularism, consider themselves above the fray of world religions are prone to such amusement. They're taking a evaluative bird's-eye view of others, amazed about how primitive they are and how primitive they were, and about religious instincts that seem now to be irrelevant. I perceive Africans have a very different response to what we nowadays call world religion. On world religion field trips, they took what Indians would tell them, people of Eastern religions, as really challenging their own ways of life, not as exotic and strange and peculiar, not examining them from some kind of objective viewpoint at all. So the writing of studying world religions from Maswazawa is part of academia's trying to break free from its own history in Christianity. So she says, when we complain that some illicit religiosity which may by nature be dogmatic and hegemonic, seems to be inhabiting academic discourse with impunity, do we understand our condition adequately? Maswazawa talks of apprehending sundry varieties of crypto-theology scurrying in the tribunals of science. For her, efforts at cleansing pure science from its formal origins in Christian theology are frankly riddled with partiality. Actually, that science, secularism, academia, they're all squarely rooted in the West Christian past. This is illustrated by Holland and, of course, also stated by Max Weber. Recent efforts, such as those described by Maswazawa above, at destroying this association are really building on thin air. Attempts at forging a vision of contemporary humanity independent of its origins in the Gospel of Jesus have in recent decades spawned numerous spurious efforts rooted in shallow versions of atheistic beliefs. Is it even possible to free academia from its roots in its Christian background? No. If you try to do so, you ended up destroying it. It amounts to preventing other people from benefiting from the prosperity that Europe has enjoyed. Now, attacks on Christianity come from many different quarters. People who, for various reasons, want to undermine the kind of the European ascendancy. Yet, it is Christianity that makes possible the kind of view we today have of other religions in the first place. So I'm not saying I'm against the level playing field, but the kind of bias, I guess you could say, that these days often express that befuddles young people's minds by denying them access to the truth about God, I find troubling. So, more on this below, but comparative religions as a discipline, I think risks being a bit of a farce. And if you want to kind of edit out any hierarchical valuation of religions from academic work, wow, that's incredible. And the media's role and other people's role in occluding these kind of truths from the populace maybe is immoral. So we have this kind of widespread understanding that those moral standards that Protestants struggled to acquire for themselves for centuries are now just kind of everywhere. So the world religions discourse is historically and empirically false. So Sri-Kantan, he looks at Hinduism and particularly the Hindu legal system. And frankly, we can say those Hindus who use their contemporary Hinduism to kind of counter Christianity fail to realize a deep contradiction in what they're doing, in which, in other words, Hindu legal systems, Hindu practices were put in writing and kind of, what would you say, ordered, clarified, using theological methods that, of course, were habitually used already over centuries, and then so formed over centuries through study of the Bible. So when you look at Hindu practice as kind of defined in formal ways, what you actually find is that yes, the case studies are Hindu, but the methodology used to describe them are very much Christian. Such kind of description just couldn't have happened without heavy reliance on what? The Old Testament. Let's look at Buddhism. Almond wrote about Buddhism, and again he finds that its spirits, having been steeped in centuries of Christianity, that caused them to define Buddhism in a particular way. Hence, it shouldn't surprise us that Buddha tends to come across as a Christ-like figure, seeming a bit like Martin Luther, reforming old traditions and bringing in new ones. Well, the people who wrote about Buddhism had that deeply ingrained in their own understanding of history. So I think we can say that all world religions have been verified as a result of projections of Christianity onto them. Even those who share roots with Christianity, Judaism and Islam, their contemporary understanding in the Western world, and therefore the globalized world, is very much influenced by the fact that they're considered religion, a category which has deep and wide Christian roots. So how can we reject Christianity in favor of Buddhism when Buddhism is kind of formed in the first place by Christianity to be a kind of a version of Christianity, an idealized version of Christianity? The Buddhism is not formed by people who actually live Buddhist lives. It's formed by theoreticians who kind of put Buddhist doctrines, as they see them, in parallel with Christian ones. Islam, similar, not exactly invented by Western Christians, but interpreted by Western Christians. The terminology used to describe Islam is, of course, a terminology that has roots in Christianity. So to kind of decide that either Islam or Buddhism are in some way superior to Christianity using European languages is really to deny history. Might be ironic, and of course there's much irony in all this, that Christianity could be rejected, and that should result in some people's viewing that Buddhism is better. Often the rejection of Christianity arises from it's being considered its history, its historicity, where that very historicity of Buddhism, if it were examined, it would be found that actually its roots are so deep in Christianity. In other words, that historical background that causes some people to reject Christianity must be ignored in order to credit other world religions. Textbook Buddhism's acclaim ignores ways in which Buddhism has been built on the back of Christianity. So, historical criticism of the Bible, it kind of undermines things, and we have to look at the ecumenical councils as if they're political events rather than ecclesial events. The political versus religious dualism has been very effectively undermined nowadays by Timothy Fitzgerald, by the way, for those who want to see religion as somehow too political. Well, maybe religion and politics aren't distinct categories anyway. Maybe the category of politics has been drawn from religion or from Christianity in the first place. So the supposedly secular historical method that scholars consider to have undermined the Church's claims seems not been applied to other world religions. Why? Because if you applied them, you reveal too much about their own history in Christianity. Let's look at anti-development. The perceived reality and threat of other religions shook the Christian more deeply than anything else, said Ernst Troels. The outcome of calling other people's practices by the same Christian name of religion indeed has kind of threatened to undermine the faith of some believers. Why should people believe the Christian religion if it's just one of many? Good answers to this question can seem hard to come by, particularly for those who haven't thought very deeply about it. Like, if I'd been born in Thailand, I would have been a Buddhist. If in India, a Hindu. If in Africa, an African traditionalist. So my devotion to Christianity thus being totally arbitrary, almost like a geographical accident, in that respect seems to be misguided. As a young man raised in the West, I was brought up with the notion that one shouldn't, of course, walk over other people's religion. So I came to Africa in 1988, expecting to respect the religion of the people I found. I spent first 3 years of my missionary career, if you like, actually teaching agriculture. In other words, I wasn't at the time teaching the Bible or Christianity, but I was very much a Christian and very determined not to ram my religion down people's throats. So it was a kind of amazing surprise to me when I got to Zambia. I didn't have to ram my gospel down people's throats or my belief, because the people were so enthused by the gospel already. They often seemed more enthused about Jesus than I was. They were gung-ho for the Bible and for Christianity. On their own account, I didn't have to do any ramming. They discovered themselves the truth of God, the truth of the Christian message. Some would even consider some of my missionary colleagues to be less than Christian because of certain ways that they behaved. So when a populace is voluntarily gung-ho wanting to appropriate Christianity, you've been brought up to kind of be embarrassed by your Christianity. What's going on? Now, Gifford refers to something like this. Niehaus was doing research in South Africa. Then his South African assistant James, he becomes ill. Niehaus decides to kind of follow up the course of James's illness, how it develops. James, we're told, was so convinced that his condition was a result of witchcraft, he refused medical help till the bitter end. He thus refused, directly and indirectly, what might have enormously improved and lengthened the quality of his life. Medically speaking, James's early death was clearly preventable. Now, if a case of belief in witchcraft can thus result in an early grave, and one wonders how many people, let's say, go that way, then should anthropologists be neutral? Can they be neutral if they deny people truths that could so improve their lives? I suggest, in fact, millions of people succumb, much as James did, through their failure to demythologize their witchcraft beliefs through faith in Christ. So there's a moral case for trying to undermine someone's fear of witchcraft, if doing so will improve length and quality of life. In other words, religions aren't kind of neutral things. So interfering with someone's religion, trying to change someone's religion, in inverted commas, can be very pragmatically a way of helping them to improve their life. Yet, in contemporary scholarship, this kind of notion is kind of seen as abhorrent. Instead, we have to respect everyone's religion, as everybody indicated, and see them all as kind of equals. Which should amaze us really when we think how long Christendom had hold on Europe and how much all of us Europeans have been profoundly affected by it. Gindra tells us ignoring the connection between culture and poverty indicates a basic failure of scholarship. Few scholars, though, seem to realize the damage being done by conscious expunging of Christianity from histories. Of course, in the West, this is less evident. In other words, the impact of Christianity continues, it's only gradually being undone. But in much of Africa, where they're only just being introduced to Christianity, the picture is very different. And the deceptions of secular scholarship can seem very shallow indeed. Africans constantly get reminders of their not very glorious past. They seem to, my impression is they're still standing on the edge of a way of life that nowadays would be seen by almost everybody as incredibly difficult, cruel and barbaric. Thus, many Africans are rushing to salvation in Christ to bring relief from those oppressive forces that just historically were very nearby and that they can still perceive are constantly threatening to encroach back onto them. So the West denying the real origins of world religions, being Christianity, is denying Africa, or trying to make it difficult for Africa to appropriate the truths that the West has really benefited from. This, by the way, is a massive and important point. By undermining faith in Christ, propaganda about a multiplicity of religions has been an enormous foundation for a propagation of injustice that is continuing to perpetuate poverty in the majority world. So, despite the massive uptake of secular ways of life, supposedly by the non-Western world, fudging Christianity is creating difficulties. Must remember, of course, raw secularism doesn't make sense. Secularism is like a complement to religion. So outside of the Western world, secularism is always interpreted in non-secular ways. What's that to say? As if it's a religion. The foundational definition for secularism that I think is helpful is that it's that which is not religion, and secularism was so defined in the days when religion was basically Christianity. So if you go beyond the realms of Christianity, it's hard to know, of course, what secularism is. So Calhoun, Juggensmeyer and Van Antwerpen illustrate this. They acknowledge that there are many secularisms, amongst which Western secularism is unique. That is to say, the term secularism does not carry its Western content when it comes to be used either in English or in translation in other parts of the world. There are many non-secular ways of understanding secularism. So here we're coming to the issue of a globalized language and this kind of understanding, deception that when someone knows English they will understand what the English are talking about, and categories like secularism, which may not be the case at all. Secularism is actually the name for something known in the UK which when exported describes something different. In the West, secularism works to some extent as a complement to religion, i.e. to Western Christianity. But when there's no Western Christianity, the concept of secularism, of course, crumbles. Now, I'm not denying here, of course, that secularism has advantages. I think the advantages are evident depending exactly how you define secularism. But I'm saying that those advantages are enjoyed by relatively few people whose lives have been transformed by the gospel. Some additional background. Acceptance of the dominant world religions paradigm, i.e. that there are a number of equivalent world religions kind of elbowing for prominence, has been, of course, the media's excuse for remaining religiously neutral as far as they can, endeavouring to be religiously neutral, because if they prioritise or promote any one religion, then they would no longer appear to be a neutral body. But when we realize that all other world religions acquire their value from the way they've been defined by Christianity, surely the picture changes. So-called religious neutrality of the media should be recognized for what it is, painting everyone, ironically, deserving or undeserving, with a Christian brush. Today's media emphasizes the parts of people's ways of life that complement Christianity. The secular, assuming, of course, that the rest of people's lives, i.e., their religion, is Christian-like. When as a result everything else looks Christian same, perhaps we should not be surprised that all that remains to report is a so-called secular realm. In other words, the assumption that world religions are similar and that they are equally valuable and they have the same value as Christianity, well, then you look at what is not religion in order to find significance, and that, of course, the media does a great deal. Actually, scholars say secularism is the latest expression of Christianity. And when the media recognizes secularism in supposedly non-Christian people's lives, what it constantly does around the world in its reporting is in effect misleadingly dishonest and distorting the global population as if they're all Christians. So here to me is a foundation for the importance to have some Western missionaries to the majority world acquire very careful listening ears to be able to hear the people they are reaching. In contemporary times it's hard to find even one Westerner, say, whose ears receptivity to African languages is not dulled, either by failure to use African language on a regular basis, or for their kind of sugar daddy reputation for buying compliance to handouts. Those missionaries, to me, it seems, are kind of deceived and deceptive. The use of people's own language is just so vital, yet they fail to perceive the content of indigenous discourse. When English assumes the existence of religions that are in opposition to Christianity, that's what those missionaries see. When actually what world religions, as they're called, do may not be overtly opposed to Christianity at all. Inter-religious competition can rather be generated by the media. So the above hegemony of Christianity that I've been talking about, of course, is not without cause. It results as a simple truth, and that truth is that there is one God, creator of all mankind, about whom we learn in the biblical scriptures. God sent his Son, Jesus, to die for mankind. Given that truth, why all this befuddlement being engaged through this poorly grounded faith that we have something called world religions? So, coming to a conclusion, in the light of what I've been presenting, how should this comparative religions debate go forward? Miguez argues, looking at Genesis 10:11, multilingual situations are not a curse but a blessing. In other words, diversity in understanding things, use of different categories, is part of God's plan. Debates about world religions conducted in Western English that presuppose secularism as kind of a normal force results in the evaporation of many mysteries into thin air. In the light of confusion caused through dependence on translation into the unknown, an important rectifying step is to replace reliance on global scholars feeding academia with their productions in English with Western-born people learning other language culture systems. That is, to learn about other doesn't require the other to speak to us in English. It requires the English speakers to expose themselves to their way of life, lived using their own languages, so as to be able to communicate back home. This can be achieved through what we call vulnerable mission. The concerns that the West has that cause it even to begin to consider global comparison with other religious selves, of course, arises from the West's peculiar Christian history. The very foundational concern that world religions should be in discourse is Christian, and that's where the concern always seems to come from. So for the Christian world, there's actually only one religion, that is Christianity, if only because the very term religion itself is a projection of Christianity. Others around the world, if it weren't for financial benefits they gain from participating in the debate and understanding themselves in certain ways, I don't really think they would get on board with our world religions discourse at all. It shouldn't surprise us. I mean, ways of life are rooted in long-standing traditions. So certain concerns that Christians have that come from their own Christian faith may be of no evident importance to others at all. There is no universal thing called religion. So Western so-called world religions are projections of Western Christianity onto other people's ways of life. In theory, if there were religions all over, then secularism might be able to thrive. But when religions are projected, so is secularism. And when secularism is projected onto other people, the assumption that, say, African people, Indian people can be secular, then that projection from the West doesn't take local realities into account. This cannot result in sustainable development, something that, of course, we're all looking for today. The pretense that it does, the pretense that everyone is kind of has a secular side, has the world gripped in a vice of deception. So the medias and academia suppose religious neutrality has them presupposing existence of established Christianity in places where they should be promoting the share of the gospel. Because other world religions are taking as pseudo-Christianities, then the assumption is that what Christians have learned, they've also learned, which may be just frankly wrong. But to point out that is wrong is not considered legitimate. Let's just add to say I don't consider this presentation a case of Christian triumphalism. If there is a triumph, then it's God and not Christianities. I'm not saying Christians are better people. I'm saying God is a better God. And certainly myself as a Christian believer, I always struggle, particularly with myself. More to the point though, I don't see this presentation as being triumphant, but as unraveling a puzzle, exposing mysteries, and uncovering a set of deceptions.